something over 30% of Labor seats voted no. Even some Greens voted no.
They can use this referendum result as some excuse to shovel through some sort of, new regime which will control social media and stifle innovation.
The country's been run into the dirt. Crime is all-time high. Hospitals are overrun.
There are many different lessons to be learned from last week's resounding no result in the Voice to Parliament referendum, and in due course I will cover many different aspects of those lessons, most notably what we can do that will actually improve outcomes for Indigenous Australians in remote communities. We all want that. But before we go there in coming weeks and months, I'd like to point out that this no result is proof, if any more were needed, that we do actually have agency in our political future, despite what some people might want you to believe. Before the referendum, we saw people in the no camp, people who believe in equality, believe in freedom, in personal choice and personal responsibility, throwing their hands up in the air and making statements like, "The fix is in. It'll just be rigged anyway. The UN won't allow them to lose." Oh, nonsense, of course. Some people even go so far as to mock people like me, those of us who believe that we have a responsibility to be engaged. Politically, culturally, certainly in the information wars. They like to call me controlled opposition or part of the problem, because I'm willing to actually engage with the powers that be, corrupt as they are, and work with the system we have, broken as it is, to get less bad outcomes than would otherwise be the case. Some people seem to almost want to be powerless, to have no actual ability to influence anything at all. And they seem almost offended at the fact that I believe, and I believe the Voice result shows, that we absolutely do have considerable influence in our lives. The fix is not in. It's not rigged. It is up to us. We have influence in our lives and the lives of those around us, and we have not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to do all that we can to make the world a better place. No, we can't fix everything. Yes, there are absolutely things that are beyond our control. But that makes it all the more important for each of us to do what we can do, and to not just throw our hands up in the air in despair and do nothing. The Voice isn't the first time we've had a big win against all odds. It's not the first time that we've had all the elites, the corporates, the media, the celebrities and all the money all on the wrong side, and just us common people on the right side, and won. The Republic referendum, whatever your stance on Australia becoming a republic, was an example of all the money and power being on one side, the common people on the other, and the common people won. It happened again with the emissions trading scheme during the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd backstabbing era. It happened again with the new Media Council, basically the Ministry of Truth, the predecessor to the current ACMA misinformation disinformation bill, by the way. We won those fights against all odds. We won the Voice fight too. Not that it feels like much of a win, all that money and goodwill wasted on something that was a terrible idea to begin with. But guess what? We can keep winning more fights as we go forward. This terrible ACMA misinformation disinformation bill, we can stop it, just like we stopped the News Media Council. The Global Pandemic Treaty, we can get Australia to say no to that, just like we got Australia to say no to the Voice. Net zero, we can lead Australia to abandon it, just like we led this country to abandon the emissions trading scheme. Don't listen to the voices of doom, to people who insist that they control everything and we can do nothing. Yes, getting involved costs time, energy, focus, sometimes money, and you risk failure, even if you give it your best shot. But not getting involved can cost you everything. And giving up without a fight? Well, to me, that seems unthinkable. So next time you have an opportunity to support people who are fighting for what's right, would you consider actually doing it? Getting involved on the ground, because those volunteers who stood on polling booths, stuffed letterboxes, did the groundwork for the No campaign, they're not just relieved about the result. They're proud because they were a part of it. They, instead of giving up, they got busy. And we need more of those people because we have more fights ahead. But mark my words, they are fights that we can win. And we must. Now, here's the news. Well, the Voice referendum was held on Saturday. The results came fairly quickly. Of course, a referendum requires a double majority. That's a majority of states. There's only 6 actual states, so that means 4 out of the 6 states had to vote yes. And after that, a majority of the citizenry also had to then vote yes. It became very clear very early in the night that that simply was not going to happen, and by 9 p.m. it was all over, bar the shouting. But a man who worked very, very hard to try and achieve a no result was Warren Mundine. He joins me right now here on the Aussie Wire. Warren, how are you?
Good to see you.
What's the feeling for you? An enormous amount of work went into this, but at the same time, I get the sense, having watched the coverage of the No campaign's watch party, I guess party is probably the wrong word, there wasn't really a sense of celebration about this result, though.
No, it was really weird, I suppose, because it's unlike any election campaign, and people do vote across party lines. Something over 30% of Labor seats voted no, and then you look at even some Greens voted no, so it's more of a relief that we were able to stop the amendment of the Constitution, and it was just really about sitting down and having a drink and a cup of tea and talking to people who work so hard in the campaign.
Well, I think that's the key. There were people, yourself included, but of course there were so many people that volunteered, so many people that pounded the pavement, stuffed letterboxes, handed out how to vote cards and supported the campaign, and it's certainly worth acknowledging their efforts. I want to finish on a positive note and talk about what we can do to make a real difference, but before I go there has been a big blow up recently. I'm going to bring some data up here. This is from the AEC. This is showing the seat of Nyunggai and the fixed polling positions that voted overwhelmingly no against the referendum. And here shows a selection of the mobile polling stations. This is where the AEC goes out to extremely remote communities. And we see there that they voted overwhelmingly yes. Now, a lot's being made out of this. A lot's being claimed that this proves that obviously there was an overwhelming support amongst the Indigenous community, and that really the implication being that sort of white Australia, racist Australia, if you like, has deprived Indigenous Australians of something that they so clearly wanted. What's your take on this data?
Well, to me, it's just they're just playing games. To be honest, we have seats in regional New South Wales and Queensland, and that have large Aboriginal populations, and they voted no. And so so to me, this means nothing. And also, there is, and Senator Jacinta Price raised it on tonight. There are question marks about that because these communities, English is their second, third, fourth, or even fifth language. So they send Aboriginal Land Council send out interpreters, and they then interpret it. We know from anecdotal evidence that the interpreters say, "Don't vote for this person; they're racist," and vote for that person. So that's there needs to be a lot more investigation and looking at those seats.
Certainly those remote polling booths do appear to be outliers. I've done some coverage of that on my own Topher social media there, looking into the statistics and comparing that to the NT, and I'll move on to comparing that to parts of New South Wales as well in coming days. However, while I've got you here, Warren, and I'm so grateful for your time, you're a very busy man and very much in demand and very much deserving of a break. The last thing you want is to be on more media like this. But I really want to pick this up because this is something that came out. I listened to you speak in Wodonga when you were on the campaign trail campaigning for the no vote. And you mentioned while you were speaking that there was a reform that you had a hand in, I believe it was in 2019, to do with reforming native title and giving Indigenous Australians more of a say and more power and the ability to make better decisions over their own lives. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on what that was and what went wrong, why that hasn't had the opportunity to succeed yet?
Well, it was really about dealing with home ownership and investments. There's a problem of investment in a home ownership in Aboriginal communities because the lands are collectively inalienable title, which means it's owned by the collective of the group or the clan who's in charge of that area, and then that is, and through the Land Rights Act and that the Native Title Act, they have to go through the Land Council. So you've got this sort of gatekeeper type thing. Now, this usually takes a long time to get processed in that. So what we did at the time, and the minister was Nigel Scullion from the Territory, we twigged the legislation so people can can make town plans and economic plans for the land that they own. And so we went ahead with that, and we got it moving along. But unfortunately, after the 2019 election, when Ken Wyatt came in, he twigged it back, and we asked why, and he said because he wanted a relationship with the Aboriginal Land Councils. What that does, as everyone knows, that owning your home and being able to do that is the first steps in economic independence. And it was really weird because we had people in the mining industry getting $150,000, $200,000 salaries, but couldn't own their land on Aboriginal land.
It's extraordinary, and what it reeks to me is that we've actually locked Indigenous Australians into a collectivist, a socialist experiment, and unfortunately that's going about as well as socialism has everywhere else that it's been tried. Well, Warren Mundine, thank you so much for your incredible work. Take a well-deserved break. I do look forward to having you back on the Aussie Wire in future. I want to explore these issues of real solutions that can make a real difference a lot more deeply. But for now, Warren, thank you so much for coming on. Can you believe that this is episode 49 of the Aussie Wire News already? Next episode on Thursday of this week will be our 50th, meaning that we've brought you nearly 200 stories already. And as if that wasn't enough, we're about to send a team of 4 journalists all the way to London to cover the launch of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. This is an initiative led by Jordan Peterson and others to counter the influence of the likes of the World Economic Forum and to provide pro-human solutions that celebrate individual rights and individual dignity instead of the socialist solutions that are always being proposed by the UN and NGOs. It's been an incredible first 6 months for the Aussie Wire News. We're proud of what we've accomplished and we're excited for what lies ahead. Next week, we'll have the news as usual, but it'll be pre-recorded because I'll be on my way to London. Then we'll have a 2-week hiatus where there's no news because we'll be bringing you front row seat coverage from the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship launch. Now, it's a 3-day event which features many amazing people. We look forward to interviewing, all of them, to listening to them as they speak and to seeing the vision of the ARC take shape. And if you want the absolute best seats in the house, then you need to become an insider. Now, insiders are financial supporters here at the Aussie Wire, and in return for their monthly financial support, they get giveaways, with over $2,000 worth of tickets and merchandise given away already in just our first 6 months, by the way. Plus, they get exclusive content, and they'll be getting lots of exclusive behind-the-scenes, insider-only content from the ARC launch. And of course, in addition to that, they get the wonderful community of fellow insiders too. And honestly, our insiders are the reason we can do crazy things like take a team of 4 journalists to the ARC launch on the other side of the planet and give you all front row seats. So even if you're not an insider, you're benefiting from the fact that those insiders are willing to support us and to make these things possible. And that's why, we don't feel bad about keeping our absolute best content for just those special insiders that make it possible for everyone else to enjoy this content as well. They are an essential part, the engine room of what we do here at the Aussie Wire. And we'd love for you to become one of our beloved insiders. Now, the link is in the description. Make sure you become a financial supporter of the Locals page. That's what it means to be an insider. You don't just follow our Locals page. We're pretty sure there's actually a few hundred people that are following the Locals page where they meant to support financially, but they just kind of got confused between the two options because just following that page on the Locals page doesn't actually get you any of the exclusive content. It doesn't get you into our giveaways because at that point, you're not actually helping to financially support the Aussie Wire. It's just the financial supporters that are our insiders. Sorry to have to explain that, but it seems confusing. So click the link, follow the instructions, become a financial supporter so that you will have the best seats in the house for the ARC launch in just a few weeks' time. And if you're not an insider, and maybe you're not in a position where you can become one, that's completely fine. Just know that all of the content that we give away for free here on the Aussie Wire was made possible by our insiders. So thank you to them. Well, continuing our coverage here at the Aussie Wire of the fallout, the aftermath of the failed Voice to Parliament referendum, I've noticed a trend, and someone actually predicted this trend before I even saw it, before there was any evidence that it would happen. And the trend is that we're all being blamed for the failure of the voice referendum, not because we actually looked into things and thought, I'm not really happy with what I'm seeing and I'm not going to support this reform. No, nothing like that. It's because you were misinformed. Now, someone who saw this coming joins me here on the Aussie Wire is MP David Limbrick. Thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you did see this coming, and you've got the receipts to prove it. This is a warning that you put up shortly afterwards, actually, saying, remember that they thought you were stupid enough to support something because the banks, airlines, MC Hammer, Shaq, and literal communists, and I'm quoting you here, I'm reading it directly from Twitter, supported it. Now they will try and convince you that it didn't pass because most Australians are stupid and fell from misinformation, and they will attempt to censor it. Say hello to the ACMA misinformation bill. Don't let them get away with it. Well, Mr. Nostradamus, I'm going to rename you here. You are certainly very much on top of that because the Yes campaign has proved you very right. But before we talk about that, what is this ACMA misinformation bill that you're referring to?
Yeah, so this was a bill actually proposed by the previous government in the last term of Parliament. And what it does is, at the moment, there's like a voluntary code of conduct within the social media industry. And what they want to do is tighten up all those procedures, force social media platforms to hand over information. And if you don't do what you're told, they'll fine these platforms. So they want to strengthen up regulatory controls on social media platforms to combat what they call misinformation. Now, the problem here, of course, is who decides what's misinformation? That's the problem all along. And I would argue that much of what the government says is often misinformation. And the one thing that, I've always said was the weapons of mass destruction in the Iraq War. It was like a classic case of the government telling everyone something that was just a bald-faced lie. And so we're really concerned about this. It was totally obvious that they were going to pivot straight into misinformation because, these people who were promoting it, they can't believe that, anyone agreed with them. And frankly, it's insulting to the majority of Australians that voted no, I think, because it implies that, you're too stupid and the only way that you can ever figure anything out is when it's spoon-fed to you by the correct people and the correct voices, which is pretty dismal view of a free society.
Well, a pretty dismal view of the population that actually voted for them and gave them their position of privilege and power in the first place. It is very reminiscent of the I'm going to say gaffe because I'm assuming she wasn't supposed to say the quiet part out loud, but former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, when she made the statement, "We will continue to be your single source of truth." This appears to be that concept basically codified into law. We have seen this sort of thing before, though, and we've defeated this sort of thing before, particularly with Julia Gillard's News Media Council. That was a proposal that came out of the Finkelstein report. That was, according to all the talking heads, an inevitability. It was going to happen. And of course, we were able to defeat that and turn that around. How do you see this fight playing out over the ACMA bill?
Look, it's, now there's some opposition in Parliament. Apparently the Coalition have changed their mind and don't like the thing that they proposed in the first place now that they're in opposition. But my concern is that if the bill goes up, not that they'll fine industry, but that the industry will overcompensate or even gladly volunteer themselves for regulation. You see this in many industries. Libertarians refer to it, and in economics they refer to it as regulatory capture. So where there's an industry and the government wants to enforce regulations, then the largest players in that industry often are very happy to have the industry regulated. And what they actually do with those regulations is codify their existing business practices, which locks out new competitors and stifles innovation. Now, just imagine for a moment that they'd come up with a strict set of ways of handling misinformation through regulation. You would stifle things like, on Twitter, you would have seen now community notes, which I think is a fantastic way of combating misinformation. It doesn't rely on centralized control of the platform. What it does is rather get large numbers of volunteers who through taking actions can increase their reputation to the point where they're trusted enough to provide factual context for things on Twitter, or X as it's called now. And so you end up in a situation where the original tweet or X post wasn't deleted, but they'll have context under it. And I know as an MP, actually one of my biggest fears about using Twitter now is I don't want to get community noted. So like I'm always really careful to make sure that everything I say is factual, because it's humiliating, right? To get that community. And there's one of my favorite Twitter accounts is called Community Notes Violating People. Check it out. It's really funny. But
well, look, it's a fascinating concept. It's almost the Wikipedia decentralization of fact checking, and I am a fellow libertarian, and decentralization is one of the things that we believe works a lot better than centralization. And this may prove to be actually a really great case study in exactly that playing out. With this ACMA bill, this has been, I've heard rumblings about this bill for a while. Where is this up to? What can we expect going forward in terms of the timeline on this bill?
Well, it's interesting because it hasn't actually been introduced to Parliament. There's been an exposure draft released. They've opened for submissions, which is closed now. Our party put in a submission, and apparently it had tens of thousands of submissions. So lots of people were interested in it. But I think the government's getting a bit more heat on this than what they first anticipated.
Yeah.
So they might be rethinking it, or I don't know. But all I'm trying to do is to get ahead of the idea that, they can use this referendum result as some excuse to shovel through some sort of, new regime which will control social media and stifle innovation. I think that would be an abhorrent use of the referendum result. I think they need to contemplate a bit more carefully what they're doing here.
Well, we saw back in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd backstabbing era, we saw the combination of the emissions trading scheme, which failed, and the misinformation, disinformation bill of its time, the News Media Council, as it was called back then. The failure of those two bills was what really triggered the rolling and re-rolling of those prime ministers. We've just seen the failure of The Voice. We might be about to see the withdrawal or potential failure of this ACMA bill. Where do you stand on this argument that Anthony Albanese should step down now that The Voice has failed? Do you think that is the right thing for him to do, or do you think that that's a bit of an overreaction?
Oh, look, he put it, he needs to take accountability for the fact that he's wasted hundreds of millions of dollars here. He's caused mass, division within Australia, and it all amounted to nothing. I don't understand why he took this as a promise to the election without first agreeing with the Liberal Party, on some sort of bipartisan support. Referendums are almost impossible without bipartisan support. If he had have gotten that, agreement before the election, then you would say, well, that would have been better managed. But as it was, I don't know, he needs to at least take accountability for this. And I think a lot of people need to rethink, what they were actually trying to do here.
Well, David Limbrick, MLC, Victorian Member of Parliament for the Libertarian Party of Victoria, thank you so much for your time here today on the Aussie Wire. We're going to stay up to date with this story, and we'd love to have you back on in future.
Thanks a lot.
Well, like any good Australian, I try to pay as little attention as possible to New Zealand. We, of course, only really care about New Zealand when they try and claim one of the celebrities that we've successfully stolen from them and they've gone big, and then we're like, hey, that's ours, and New Zealand goes, well, actually, they were born here, and we're like, technicalities, you stay out of it. However, there is something very interesting that's happening in New Zealand right now, and we did talk about it last week here on the Aussie Wire. The fact that of all of the Western democracies, New Zealand, well, the stakes are actually probably the highest out of any Western democracy when it comes to who their Prime Minister is, due to the way they're set up politically. Well, they just had their general election for a new Prime Minister on Saturday. And joining me on the Aussie Wire to talk about it is Jonathan Kennelly from New Zealand. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get on to politics, what is with this penchant that New Zealand has for claiming people born in New Zealand after we've successfully stolen them? It just seems very rude.
I mean, I asked the same of you. Australia's number one expertise is in pinching the best of New Zealanders. And is it our fault? Is it your fault?
Look, moving on, before we start a trans-Tasman war, Look, you've just had your general election on Saturday, and I made the comment here on the Aussie Wire last week that a change in Prime Minister in New Zealand appears to me to be a particularly weighty matter because of the lack of a House of Review. There is a single House Parliament. There is no Senate to hold a federal government back, and there are also no states. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a federal government and you have local councils, and that's kind of it. Can you give us a bit of an understanding of how it works over there?
You could look at it that way. You could almost also say that because we're smaller, the democracy is more direct.
Okay.
Because there are fewer layers. As much as MMP was introduced in 1996, and particularly for smaller parties, it is more beneficial. But you'll find smaller parties can perhaps get a disproportionate amount of control over the eventual coalition government. How it works is we have an electorate vote. So I'm in Auckland Central or in Epsom. You have an MP. MPs vying for each electoral vote. So that's alludes to the old first past the post system, which I think sort of you're more familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, you get a party vote, and that just contributes to the overall percentage that party is number of seats that it gets in Parliament. So we have 120 seats. If your party gets 50% of the party vote, they should get 60 seats.
Mm-hmm.
By and large, that is how it works. And then you think, well, where does the electoral votes come in? Essentially, should make no difference. So the short version of it is it makes no difference. If you get 60% of the vote, you should get 60% of the seats. And you have a party list, from I guess 1 to 120, mm-hmm. If you're optimistic enough. And when you get 50%, 60 of your MPs go in. Your electoral candidates will be in that list.
Right.
And if they're not in the top 60, then they will by default fall in that top 60, and poor old Mr. 60 gets turfed out. So you always get the right, your percentage always goes in as according to the party vote, but that can be slightly, the actual people that go into Parliament, could be slightly different based on the electoral fallout. But by and large, not, because generally your electoral MPs are also high up on the party list.
Well, look, I thank you for that explanation. I am even more confused than I was before. So we're going to, once again, twice in one interview, we're going to move on before we start a trans-Tasman war, because I'm across politics and I do not understand what's going on there. Now, you have just had a general election. This was a pretty clear repudiation of the Labor Party. This was, of course, Jacinda Ardern's party. She was the queen of lockdowns. She was competing with Daniel Andrews in my former home state of Victoria to be the harshest and the most draconian. She famously talked about the government being your single source of truth. But she left before this election. Do you think that she saw the writing on the wall, or do you think that this result is because she wasn't there and that her cult of personality might have carried them more successfully?
No, she's pretty smart, pretty savvy. She knew the writing was on the wall. The country's been run into the dirt. Crime is all-time high. Auckland's mortality is skyrocketing, but they managed to keep that relatively quiet. But as a result, the hospitals are overrun. The economy is just really rubbish. Inflation is high, and for those of us like yourself and myself, we all knew this had to happen. You don't get to, have your cake and eat it too. You lock down, you close the borders for a month, and then you're going to run your country into the ground.
Yeah.
So, she had it great. Their party did get about 50% of the vote in the last election, and now it's just bottomed out as everything we predicted would happen has come true. She knew it would too. I guess she probably knew, but politically speaking, she did all the right things.
Yeah.
And she got out on the high. Smart girl.
Yeah. Well, this is an old electoral map here of New Zealand. It doesn't shed any light on what you've just described. It still makes no sense to me whatsoever. But what I can understand is the fact that there's been a massive change. We've seen a sweeping change happen now. The Nationals, it will be Chris. Is it Loxon? I think it is. Will be the new
Luxon, yes.
Luxon. Thank you. Will be the new Prime Minister. But there is some questions around which parties he's going to have to negotiate with in order to actually form a coalition. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. So ever since 1996, when the MMP came through, it's almost always been the case that a coalition has been required. In fact, the previous election, 2020, Ardern got the 50%. She pretty much was able to govern by herself, but she involved the Greens anyway because the Greens essentially the extreme version of Labor. And so similarly on the other side, you see National, their extreme version is ACT. And they are, yes, the policies on their page are excellent, and cards on the table. I have consistently voted for them up until this election.
Oh, really?
So yeah, they've been great. Look, I've been involved in the past in the 2008 election. A personal friend standing, and I've got other friends who've been very involved, very high up, and very libertarian, or they were at least.
Right.
For those of us who are more attuned to genuine matters, such as freedom of autonomy and medical freedom and just not being locked down.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they came out. They now have a pretty good track record of being very authoritarian in that regard.
Right. That's unfortunate.
As I tell everyone, look, yes, definitely act. You have them run the country. It will be run incredibly efficiently, profitably. Everyone will be wealthier. But if we have another COVID situation or the next version of that, which might be, the digital currency, a financial
Climate
crash or something like that.
Maybe. Yeah.
The difference between a COVID national government versus a Labor Green government essentially is that because National and ACT are so much more competent and intelligent, they'll just lock you down even better than the previous government. They'll have us in the gulags far more efficiently than the previous government. The previous government, had terrible ideas and they implemented them even worse.
Yeah.
This National ACT, they're smart people, and unfortunately, things like whether or not what drugs and you decide to put in your body, when in certain scenarios they'll be quite happy to make it very difficult to get out of that. So great policies on paper.
Well, you're painting a bit of a grim picture. Now, I can remember not so long ago, to be honest, when New Zealand was actually thriving, your dollar reached parity with the Australian dollar. A lot of New Zealanders who had come to Australia because they thought there was more opportunity here actually started to head back home again, realising the grass wasn't actually greener and that New Zealand was really doing very, very well for itself. That, of course, has changed dramatically under the last couple of administrations of Labor government and Jacinda Ardern. As you said it yourself, the country's been run into the ground. Focusing on that economic side of things, putting aside the COVID response, etc., are you convinced that we're about to see New Zealand rebound? And to what degree? What could New Zealand become under better management?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, our resources and the people of New Zealand and the resources we have to hand, we've got no excuse. So yes, absolutely, with competent people and looking after the economy and just generally making more intelligent decisions, we are definitely going to rebound economically. So that's great. In the meantime, I'm looking forward to that as long as I'm able to enjoy it.
Goodness, life is more complicated than we want it to be, isn't it? Well, Jonathan Kennelly, thank you so much for bringing us this report, this update on the New Zealand election. I'm going to keep an eye on how things go over the pond in New Zealand because I think it's a wonderful little microcosm, a wonderful experiment in what can happen when you go from extreme anti-prosperity policies to what I hope we will see is some very pro-prosperity policies, and I'd love to see a really rapid turnaround. Jonathan Kennelly from New Zealand, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com. Be sure to join our email list while you're there, and be sure to read our amazing blog posts from guest authors including Joanne Nova, Rebecca Barnett, Alex Story, Crystal Mitchell, myself of course, and there are other guest authors as well. Follow all of our socials via @theaussiewire, and please help to spread the word. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.